Hey everybody, it's Party Elite continuing the beginner's guide for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2. Today we're going to take a quick look at ship stats, what they mean, and why they matter. So if you're looking at these and wondering what do the numbers mean, this is the video for you. Just a quick reminder that if you'd like to see more guide videos, you should let me know with a like and a comment down below, and feel free to suggest topics or provide your own tips on the topic at hand down below as well. I've got a few planned, but your requests obviously matter. With no time to waste, let's begin. Ship stats can be seen during fleet creation and during battle, the latter being quite helpful since nobody can be expected to remember every detail about every ship, but everybody can try to utilize the information available behind a couple of clicks. Stats are typically the same across ships in the same class in the same faction. You'll see some patterns evolve, and you can use that to get a better read on the enemy when you first spot them on the field of battle. Sometimes the patterns are as simple as this faction has no shields ever, and sometimes it's a bit more nuanced, like some ships have equal armor on all sides, whereas most are weaker on the sides and rear. I'll get into those specifics for my faction guides, but this video is more about understanding what the stats mean and, more importantly, what you need to do about them. Shields are the first line of defense against most damage. Represented by the blue bar above a ship, shields drop as they get hit until they're zeroed. After that, there's a 10-second delay of vulnerability, followed by more vulnerable time spent as the shields recharge until full. The number here states just how much damage the shield can take, but remember that some types of attacks, weapons, and abilities completely ignore the shield or have a chance of ignoring shields. The best use of this information is in finding out who you should keep an eye on. If you're planning on performing tactical retreats, and as an attacker, it should help you determine where to use certain abilities. As I said, some abilities and weapons ignore shields to varying degrees. It makes sense to use said abilities and weapons against a ship that has more shields. As an example, bomber squadrons cause direct hull damage, guaranteed to completely ignore shields. If your enemy has two ships that you can see, one with 200 shield and one with 800 shield, it'd make most sense to send those squadrons after the ship with 800 shield before you use them against the ship with only 200 shield, that you could strip away using other weapons very easily. Now keep in mind that this advice is situational. If there's a priority target on the field, then by all means focus all efforts on it, but when you have a choice, make sure you don't choose wrong. Hull points are the actual hit points of a ship. Pretty self-explanatory. When this number reaches 0, the ship is destroyed. Understanding these numbers will help you find the softest enemy targets to focus down on to get rid of them quickly when you're presented with a range of targets. Now this is always tied to the size of a ship as well. A bigger ship will have more hull points. Armor is a more interesting stat divided into front, side, and rear sections. As the name implies, it determines how much armor each section of the ship has to protect its hull. The number you see here is a percentage value of damage reduction to the hull. Very important to remember, it is a percentage value. So an armor of 83 means that 1 damage point actually becomes 0.17 damage points, whereas it's 0.5 damage when armor is 50. So you can see just how big a difference this number makes, and just how big a deal it is when you're firing into the front of some ships as opposed to their backs. Sometimes armor is the same across the board, but typically side and rear armor is lower. On the receiving end, this should clearly outline to you when you want to expose which part of your ship to the enemy. Damage is inevitable. Once the shields have been taken down, damage is going to hit the hull, but the armor is going to help reduce that damage as it comes through. And it's important to understand that some ships are better than others at taking shots to the sides. Maybe they should be closer to the enemy when performing broadsides, intercepting incoming shots, protecting the ships of yours that are weaker on the sides. For ships with weak side armor but great broadsides, you might consider facing the enemy head-on until you're able to get behind them, and then switching to broadsides for safe broadside shots. On the attacking end, this should tell you where on an enemy ship you should be aiming to hit. Also, keep an eye on weapons and abilities that specifically say they count armor as a certain amount, typically 50%. Use these weapons and abilities against heavily armored parts of enemy ships. The rule of thumb is typically the rear of the ship is the ideal target. It has less armor and it can't shoot back. Also, keep armor values in mind when you're planning on your ramming maneuvers. Again, hull damage will hit both ships as they ram into each other, so armor will come into play there. Identification range is the radius of the distance at which the ship can identify an enemy blip. This is not the scanning range, which seems to always be a radius of 4,500, and is where you can spot and identify enemy ships that are using stealth in one way or another. Don't quote me on that radius though. Now you'll notice that every once in a while a ship will have its ID range given in green. That's because it's exceptionally good compared to other ships in the same class for that faction. Keep an eye on this for when you want to use range to your advantage. Just as a reminder, you can only shoot at ships that you've identified, so don't let your identification range limit your firing. This stat, in my opinion, is especially important to look at when building a fleet to make sure you've got recon coverage as you need it. Again, to stress the point, if you haven't identified a ship, you cannot shoot it. It doesn't matter which ship has done the identification, but some ship has to do it before the target can be fired upon by the rest of your fleet if necessary. What's good is that when you're actually mid-battle, you can see identification range represented by the outer blue ring surrounding your ship. The inner blue ring is the scanning range where stealth ships get spotted. Now if you select an enemy ship, you can see their identification and scanning ranges by looking at these two rings. Again, outer ring is detection, inner ring is scanning. You want to stay outside of the enemy detection range with most of your ships, and you want to stay outside of the enemy scanning range with your stealth ships. Now a good way to measure ranges without having to select a ship is by looking at the grid. Each grid square is actually 1,000 units. So if you have 4,500 as the scanning range of a ship, you can count out 4 squares and a half, and you'll figure out where that scanning range is approximately. Use your eyes when you're trying to be fast, or go ahead and select the ship if you have the time to actually go ahead and see exactly where that line falls. Speed is a pretty self-explanatory stat. It determines how quickly a ship moves forward when using a regular move order. This speed will be reduced when engines are damaged, and it'll be increased when using special maneuvers. Speed will help you determine the rate at which you can make snap decisions, what ships you can catch up to, where should you give up on the chase, things like that. As long as you're going straight, that is. Rotation speed tells you how many degrees a ship can turn in a second. I personally use this number relatively. In other words, it helps me understand who can turn faster or slower based on how these numbers compare between two ships. You can use it to calculate how long certain turns will take, and I find the best use of it is to know who would be first to pull off a broadside, quickly rotate 180 degrees, and then get off another broadside. Typically, smaller ships turn faster than bigger ships, and remember, using something like a high energy turn will increase this rotation speed during that turn. Defense turrets refers to the number of turrets that the ship has to provide point defense capabilities, and can be seen mid-battle by looking at this number over here. Turrets also fire on enemy ships to cause marginal damage, but their real value is in shooting down incoming torpedoes and enemy squadrons. Torpedoes and squadrons should not be underestimated. They cause a great deal of damage in one way or another, and so having a decent number of turrets on key ships, such as your flagship, can be very helpful against a torpedo-heavy or hangar bay-heavy enemy. It's also important to know that defense turrets don't just cover the ship they're on, but also the region of space around the ship, meaning a bunch of ships with lots of turrets will actually protect each other very effectively. When on the attacking side, you want to take a look at enemy turret counts to find ships that are vulnerable to torpedo and squadron attacks. If you're going in with a hangar bay heavy approach, the ideal move is to use fighter squadrons to first destroy turrets, and then, when you see this number is down to 0, send in bomber or boarding squadrons to damage hull or troop counts respectively. Now, outside of the enemy having interceptor squadrons available, your own squadrons are free to cause a great deal of hurt with little concern for their own well-being. To see this in action, check out the battle I've linked to under the eye at the top right corner of this screen. It's a specific build that relies heavily on this kind of activity, so check it out. Maybe it'll explain things a bit better seeing it in action. Bravery is a very interesting stat that I'm going to explain in a couple of different ways just to make sure I'm being as clear as possible. It might sound like this is the morale bar, or that this is the number that determines when something decides to mutiny. And that's not at all the case. But let's touch on morale for a second, because that's what bravery affects. Morale is represented as this bar, and it doesn't always apply. Some factions are completely unwilling to give up. When this bar empties, a ship mutinies, or returns to a feral state in the case of the Tyranids. Either way, a ship that has lost all morale can't be ordered in any way, and is going to make its way off the map unless you use some method to bring it back into the fold, a topic for another time. Now, how bravery ties in is actually as a factor to compound or reduce the amount of morale damage caused to a ship when morale damage is caused to begin with. The number here represents the percentage of extra damage done to morale when morale damage is done. So, a -50 means morale damage is increased by half of the base value of damage that would have happened in the first place. Meanwhile, a +50 means morale damage is decreased by half of the base value of damage that would have happened in the first place. To word it differently, because I do think it is a little confusing, to word it differently though, it's a percentage of incoming morale damage that will either add or subtract to the overall morale damage caused. With the numbers we're playing with of negative and +50 as an example, and an ability or an event that causes 100 morale damage, that's going to cause either 150 or 50 morale damage, respectively. Bravery applies on the receiving end. It affects how well or poorly morale damage is received by the ship that we're looking at. The way you can use this information is far more straightforward than how the stat actually reads and works. If an enemy ship has negative bravery, they are more prone to mutiny, and so they should be targeted with morale damaging abilities and tactics more often. For example, if your enemy ships have negative bravery values, you'll want to destroy their decks, destroy their flagships, and then seal the deal by using morale damaging abilities such as the Tyranid Psychic Scream. See that at work in the Tyranid battle under the eye at the top right corner of the screen if you'd like. It's from the second beta, but the theories all apply. Now on the flip side, if they have positive bravery values on enemy ships, that makes morale damage a low priority. Oh, and of course, if morale isn't a factor at all, then don't target bravery. Don't bother with any of that calculations. You can skip this. The next two stats I'm going to discuss together because, from a strategic perspective, a combined conversation makes most sense. Boarding damage is simply the amount of troop damage that this specific ship will cause when using the boarding action on an enemy ship. This is a good number to keep in mind, but you can always check it by hovering over the boarding action mid-battle to see how much troop damage you're going to do. It's a good idea to compare this number to the next stat if available. Lightning strike damage is only present on ships that can perform lightning strikes, so that's a different kind of boarding maneuver that needs a generator to perform, can be performed at a greater range, and can be performed at a greater angle, but it cannot penetrate enemy shields and typically does less troop damage. Most factions have access to it by default, some need specific ships or specific abilities to make it available. The number here is, once again, the troop damage this ship causes when it performs a lightning strike on an enemy ship. You want to compare this to boarding damage and see which number fits your needs at any given time. You only have 3 uses of each type of boarding, so don't wastefully use one over the other. When looking at enemy boarding damage and lightning strike damage, you want to know which ships are more dangerous when you're within boarding distance. The ones that have higher numbers are the ones you need to stay far away from, because otherwise you might end up being boarded to death. Also, if you're going in for a boarding attack, you might want to consider your boarding and lightning strike damage numbers to that of your target, so you can see how a trade might work out. Will you be able to empty the enemy's troop count before they do the same to you? Very important to know, otherwise you'll just have a drifting hulk on your hands. Critical assault chance is a pretty helpful number to know. It tells you how likely you are to get a critical hit when performing a boarding action or lightning strike. Critical hits will damage or destroy ships' systems, so you'll likely want to use ships of your own with higher critical assault chances against high-value targets whose systems you want to damage sooner rather than later. The deck of a particularly vulnerable ship, perhaps, or the weapons of a particularly terrifying Tyranid. Much like the previous two numbers, it also helps to know how dangerous an enemy ship is before you move into boarding range. If their chances of getting a crit off are very high, you need to balance the risk and reward, the chance of losing a crucial system versus the chance of pulling off whatever it is you're trying to do. Troops number ties into a couple of things. Represented in battle above each ship over here, the troop number is actually 1/3 of the total troop count on a ship. These are the people who run the ship, and as they are depleted, so too is the efficiency of the ship, something I touched on in my 10 Essential Tips video. The first time a ship loses this number of troops, 1/3 of its total troop count, it suffers a critical hit and reduced efficiency. The second time it loses this number of troops, i.e. 2/3 of its total troop count, it suffers 2 critical hits and further reduced efficiency. And the third time it loses this number of troops, the ship turns into a drifting hulk that can either be reclaimed using a boarding action or turned into a bomb by scuttling it. On the attacking side, you'll want to compare troop counts to your boarding action and lightning strike damage numbers, because how many of these boarding actions and lightning strikes would it take to make this number 0 on an enemy ship? How many times can you make this number 0? If you're timing your boarding actions, you'll only want to go in when you're guaranteed to either of these two things. If you can 0 this number once, twice, or thrice, you're causing worthwhile damage the further you go. Keep in mind that the troop number can be affected by other things as well, like fighter squadrons, abilities, and executions. So keep an eye on the number here to see what the ship's troop count is at the current level. You might not need as many boarding actions or squadrons or lightning strikes as you're about to send. On the defensive side, let this number inform you which of your ships is more vulnerable to troop damage from the enemy, especially with the number that actively updates mid-battle. Keep these ships further away, or if you really need to use the ship to perform a boarding maneuver, wait until you see the enemy perform a boarding action or lightning strike elsewhere so you know it's safe to approach. Troops are important. Again, these are the people that keep things running on your ships. Keep an eye on them before they all get killed, eaten, or sucked out into the vacuum of space, because that's game over, man. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of what the numbers mean when you're looking at a ship's stats. The whole game, of course, is based around these numbers, and all your decisions should be based around your numbers. Pretty soon, they'll become second nature, and you won't have to refer to the UI to understand what's going on, or to know inherently how certain ships are about to behave. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you'd like to see more beginners, tips, and guides on this channel about BFGA2, let me know by dropping a like and a comment down below, especially if you have tips of your own, or you have certain suggestions for topics. A massive thanks goes out to each and every one of my channel members and patrons who support this channel on a monthly basis, keeping us alive and running smoothly, and a massive thanks goes out to you for watching. Until next time, cheers.